welcome, welcome. Um, Really excited to get this started. So my name is Vince Pearson. I am the principal strategist for diversity inclusion with Sport Biz Camps. I've been working with the team for about all of this year. Super excited to have accomplished what we were able to do this year, pivoting into 2020 with the global pandemic, forcing us virtual. Um, we're coming up for air a bit. Really excited to have this conversation with the founders of the organization, Patrick Stack, Jeff Longo, Sam Renault, and really just, the mission of Sport Biz Camps is to increase social mobility for high school students through education while expanding diversity within the sports industry. But each of our founders have their own story as to why that means something to them. And so, we've hit the ground running in terms of bringing that mission to life and trying to find ways to really just shorten the path for those who may not have a direct line to access to the sports industry. But we're going to now kind of have a conversation with the founders to connect the dots on why Sport Biz Camps was created, and set the stage for what's to come. So rolling right into the conversation, just a general question. Let's just open with introductions. So Pat, why don't you start us off? Just a quick introduction, kind of on your background in the sports industry and then what you're doing now.
Want to do a shot clock? We'll keep it under 60 seconds.
That's your rule.
There's my rule. I'll try to keep short and sweet. Grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. Recognized, I guess we'll get into this later in my story, but we had the good fortune of being connected to someone that was working in the sports industry. My best friend's dad, a guy by the name of Jim Kaler, was the CMO of the Cleveland Cavaliers for pretty much my entire childhood. So I had access and insights into careers in sports probably earlier than most, and had the ability to kind of really just get experiences that most kids would love to get, that I just was able to partake in because of that proximity to that person. So, realized I wanted to work in the sports industry kind of later in life, later towards my college career. So by the time senior year, it kind of clicked that I could work in the sports industry, and pursued graduate school, and then ultimately had a career in sponsorship for about 10 years, primarily sponsorship sales at a hockey team, the Cleveland Browns professional football team, and then with an agency, and have been teaching as a professor for about the last 5 years, teaching sports management at Johnson Wales University.
Okay, awesome. And I know we're going to get to being informal. I'm passing the buck now, but Pat, what did you study when you went to school at Ohio?
Well, I was a late bloomer is probably the appropriate term. So I studied economics because I didn't have a lot of other options at the time, because I didn't really excel right out of the gate. It took me a little bit of time to assimilate and transition into the college culture. So I studied economics and then did a dual degree program, graduate program.
Gotcha. Okay, great. All right, Jeff, you're up. Just a little background on you and then where you are now.
Yeah, thanks, Vince. Most of my career in the industry has been in professional hockey. I grew up playing hockey, was a goaltender. Grew up in New Jersey. Did my undergrad at Rutgers. And again, had the good fortune of, one of my teammates had interned for the Rangers the year before I was about to graduate, told me a little bit about the role, and he'd been hired. I said, man, this would have been my dream position had I have ever known this position was a thing before this, right? So I interned with the Rangers, spent the next 12 years in minor league hockey, senior management roles, a couple seasons with the Devils, running their community initiatives and marketing in the NHL. Kind of long career in the front office side, and then have been teaching at Johnson & Wales in their sports marketing department since 2012.
Love it. Growing up a goalie, that's awesome. Good luck topping that, Sam. But just a background on you to wrap us up.
I was not a hockey goalie. I always viewed that as possibly the hardest position in all of sports. So I commend you on that one. I think I'm one of the classic stories of those who can't teach. So grew up playing sports my whole life, loved it. Meant everything to me, dabbled in a bunch of different things, but knew I was never going to be playing at an extremely high level. But like everybody, I think in this room, except maybe you, Vince, and a lot of our listeners, and definitely a lot of our students, I had no idea the world that awaited me in the sports business. So I went to Virginia Tech and was influenced by sports in that decision when I was applying for colleges. Mike Vick was running them to the national championship. And I just saw this firestorm of just passion and engagement. And I got to visit campus during that run. And just to be able to see the power of sport in a place like that, in a little podunk town that no one would have ever heard of if Frank Beamer hadn't shown up and brought it to glory. So I started as a 17, 18-year-old to see the power of sport, went to Tech, got a job with the sports information department, moved on, worked a bunch of different odd jobs, kept hitting glass ceilings for myself, still had no idea what I wanted to do, studied English at a tech school, which was one of my first stupid things that I decided to do. Went to law school on a whim, thought becoming a sports agent would be a great idea. I'm another good example of checking things off the list because I know they're not for me. So sports agent was one of those deals. I worked in that world for about 7 years, then got into academics, which was the first true rewarding career I think I had, was being able to make an impact with young people. So I helped to build and then run a graduate program at Arizona State. Resigned from that position back in June of 19 and came to Charlotte, met Stack and Longo. They were the first two people to welcome me with open arms to the Charlotte sports community, and I've been working with them on sports biz camps and a dozen other sports business, sports law, sports education consulting projects ever since.
That's awesome. What I love about, this group and hopefully it's picked up in that introduction is the actual sports experience brought to the table. I won't go dig on any other professors, but I think that experience is just valuable. It's invaluable with introducing students to that world to actually have spent time there. So now let's get straight to sport biz camps. We talked about the mission earlier to increase social mobility for high school students through education and then to expand diversity in the sports industry. Why that mission? And this is where we get to be informal. So I'm not going to pass the buck, but whoever wants to jump in, why that mission out of the gate?
I can take a stab. It's a complex question with a lot of layers to it. But I think for me, as I transitioned from industry to academia, I considered then and I consider it now, my job as a professor is 1 part education, 3 parts get you a job, right? Like you go to school to get a job. You go to college to have a career. The education is the input to that outcome. And I think that's my role. So as I was having those conversations with some students around getting them jobs, certain things weren't adding up, right? Like the things that I thought were intuitive or the access that I had or the experiences that I had, they had none of those experiences, none of those legs up. So as I started to kind of dial in to supporting individual students, primarily students of color, and helping them kind of get connected to this industry that I didn't know was like super white. I just was in it and I was white. I started recognizing there wasn't a level playing field, right? Like they didn't understand the things that I had understand or didn't have the type of support that I had. So I think that was a big part for me was, I guess, proximity to the problem. Prior to that, I really had no understanding of what I would consider, like I would consider myself, I was running down, like if you had asked me, going back to my story, like I met Jim Kaler when I was 7 years old, and he ended up being like the executive director of the master's program I went to, and it's been like my mentor, and it's pretty much like the single most important person in the arc of my career. I met him because I lived in the right neighborhood, right? Because I went to the right schools and things like that. And then I basically like was able to work I got into the system, I got into the club through those types of resources. So I used to call myself kind of lucky, like, oh man, I was just lucky. Like and then I was like kind of grateful. But once I started having these conversations, once I got more close to the situation and the proximity took over, I realized I was privileged. And that brings about like a sense of a bit of shame. It's even like awkward now to share it, but I could either feel shame or I could fuel and mobilize to be part of the solution. And that was one of many things that happened to me, was the recognition of my privilege, and that the students that I wanted to support, that and the aspirations that they had, they needed some additional support, and they need additional resources, or they need additional opportunities.
Yeah. No, that really resonates. And even listening, some of it is, you mentioned proximity. But there's also a bit of, I want to say awakening, but recognizing, it's existing within this industry, this problem, this challenge that's around us, but that there's almost an inability to see it until you have that moment where the light goes off, and now you can't unsee it, right?
Yeah, man. Like, no, but like Vince, like I didn't have any Black friends really growing up, right? Like I didn't work with a lot of Black people, like, so I was never around anyone to even, I wasn't looking for it, and B, like, I wasn't putting myself in situations to figure it out until all of a sudden I was, and then you're like, whoa, like what's going on here? Mm-hmm. So yeah, you're spot on.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And Jeff, want to hear your thoughts on it too, but also that, if this were starting the summer of 2020, a lot of folks, it might make sense to a lot of people because of just the social unrest that we're experiencing, the racial justice movement, Black Lives Matter. But this was something that started last summer. So this was, not that racism or these challenges didn't exist last summer. But they weren't necessarily front and center in a public conversation. So kind of, again, going back to the why, and maybe even some of the why and timing, why that mission for Sport Biz Camps and in your involvement?
Yeah, I think certain parts of my answer are going to be fairly similar to the Patrick's in that, I think we had a similar role to becoming aware, right? A similar time frame in our awareness. And it was the same thing. Like I grew up in a very homogenous community. And it wasn't until I expanded my universe through teaching that hey, I worked in this industry for 15 years, didn't realize just, how white, how male we were. Right. And so that same type of awakening, at least in terms of the time frame, corresponds with Pat's. And from there, I think there's such a lack of knowledge in general as to opportunities in the sports industry, right? So we all want to, get where we're getting to in the sports industry by being successful on the court, on the field, on the ice. Beyond that, once you do have an understanding and start to know what those roles are, the reality is that to be successful or to get your foot in the door, you have to know someone, right? We said that, and I used the, got lucky in quotes earlier, but without Frank, a friend of mine, a teammate of mine having that role, not only do I not know that role exists, but I don't get set up to walk in the door to succeed, right? I went in there as Frank's guy, as the guy that Frank said, here's somebody who's hardworking, et cetera, et cetera. He let me borrow his social capital from start to finish, right? So all I had to do was go in there and not mess up, right? So again, if you don't have access to that social capital, you don't have access to those relationships, you're starting off, behind the eight ball, as compared to somebody from my background or somebody, from Pat's.
Awesome. Sam?
I can jump in. I mean, the bunch of the things Pat said resonate, obviously, like the three of us, it was fortuitous and maybe serendipity that we all met and were introduced. It's symbolic of, I think, how this network works in general in the sports industry. But if I think back on an awakening for me, I can't think of a single moment where all of a sudden I just was hit over the head with, oh my gosh, here's a huge problem and I should try to make an impact here. It's just like a thousand little cuts here and there. And at some point I transitioned from, even when I was working as an agent, and you see almost everybody in the coaching staff, especially the head coaches, everybody in player personnel, like so many of them were white males. And you see the Tides report that comes out of UCF, Vince, that you had a hand in when you were there. It early on, you look at that and you're like, oh, damn, that's crazy. Somebody should do something. Or why is it like this? And then eventually you start to realize, like, it's not just something crazy that you can look at and brush off. Like, somebody actually does have to do something. And why not me? And why not the people I'm surrounded by? And so at, early on, even years past, coming up to this past spring where things have really been brought to the forefront, it was very taboo to step in and challenge somebody on their ignorance or on their sort of blindness to the problems that are going on. And I think that's been the biggest change now over the past, 6 6 months/10 years of 2020, that no one is really afraid anymore to step up and say something. And I think that's a positive and a negative, but people are emboldened on every side of this conversation. But I think there's just been so much more awareness now. And in my own experience, I worked in sports information. I've worked representing athletes. I've gone into, I grew up in upper middle class in Annapolis, Maryland, where that's actually a fairly diverse city, but really didn't have much knowledge. I went to public school and I visited with a lot of kids who grew up in Section 8 housing. So I spent some time in those neighborhoods, but still wasn't really aware of the differences that we experienced and couldn't view things from any other perspective but my own. Then I start recruiting, college NFL prospects, and I'm flying out to neighborhoods in Compton and Inglewood, where the dad of the player I'm recruiting would call me and say, look, don't drive into my neighborhood. I'm going to meet you in Center City and pick you up and drive you in, because it won't be safe for you to drive here. And things like moments like that just started to bring this new awareness that there's an entire world that exists outside of mine that I have no concept of. And those were just many little moments like that start to build and build and build an awareness inside me that there is a big problem. I've been blind to it, and I can do something here.
And I guess, Vince, to ask you a question, I think this is part of, I appreciate you asking us that, and maybe we had good answers, but you've known that, you've known that this was tilted your entire life. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think we still kind of struggle with that. How does that make you feel when the three of us are like, oh yeah, we finally got it, 30 plus years into our existence?
Well, it's interesting to put it that way, because I don't think it's similar in that it's ingrained, in that it's almost similar to Sam's point of the 1,000 little cuts. You realize it and it's happening, but sometimes it's really tough to diagnose and understand why this is happening to me. And you really begin to create, or at least I'll speak for myself, I began to create a psyche or an approach that would allow me to overcome if something were happening, a way of speaking or a way of showing up or a way of presenting myself that might overcome for any type of headwind my Blackness might create in any situation. I was similar, growing up in a bubble. I went to a predominantly white high school, but my experience was predominantly Black. I didn't know that until I got curious enough to look at the data afterwards. I went to a historically Black college out of that situation. So from there, I think when I started to realize the representation was in my internship experiences, I would often be the only Black person in the room, or one of two in the building. Again, it's not a thing where it's like, hey, does anybody see this problem? It's just like, okay, I should probably I'm probably going to want to think twice before I press send on that email. I'm probably going to want to make sure I show up 20 minutes early, because I certainly can't be one of the two Black guys that were late. So I think early in my understanding, it was more of identifying ways to counteract any potential negative impacts. But then, and I think, as I matured through college, I started to be able to give language to this a bit better, start to research this a bit more. And this is now going into the University of Central Florida with Dr. Lapchick, and start to, contextualize the problem through data, and start to put historical context as well, and see okay, this is a thing that, to Sam and to all of your points, this is not a thing that's going to shift organically. This is not a thing that's just going to disappear because a few good people said this is not right. And it's actually a good segue to the next question and I think that we have an interesting case study here, because the three of you in your stories share existing within this industry, awareness for a problem, and then a project that does something about it. I think that discrepancy between 2 and 3 is where a lot of people fall. And then we have regression to maybe we acknowledge the awareness, or maybe we just go to business as usual. I'd love to hear from you all kind of what took you from awareness to action, and kind of what steps did you take to actually bring something to life that addresses this problem?
Jeff, do you want to tackle that?
I thought you were always the
No, that's
lead off there.
I want you to go first because I have a 7-minute answer and you guys have nothing to share except, oh, I got to go with Pat said something. This is your dance floor.
Yeah, it's funny. I think a little bit of it for me is I'm sort of wired that way. When I see something happening, I don't want to correct the mistake. I want to figure out where the mistake came from and go back and chop at the root instead of swinging at the leaves, right? It takes longer to take the root down, but when the root's gone, it's that way, right? So some of my old employees, make fun of me about that in general, where like one little problem comes up and all of a sudden the system's got to change, right? Like, so, personally, I'm kind of built that way. And again, I think for us, and I say us again, because we worked through this at the same time, it was the fact of seeing it on a day-to-day basis affecting students that we cared about, and not being able to sit back and watch that happen to them without, using our ability to try to help change that system a little bit. And I think ultimately it starts and finishes with that, right? I mean, we couldn't sit idly by knowing that there was something that we can do. And our lunch conversations start to be dominated by this, and it's like, how do we do it? How do we do it? How do we do it? And putting pen to paper. And the next thing we know, we were underway.
I mean, I think one thing that we all have in common that I think made us feel compelled to action is that we're all educators. Like, that's your job, or like, we don't have to call it servant leadership, but your job as an educator is to, at least for like us, is to make an impact with people, right? Like, with people, we are helping people. So it goes back to proximity. Once the problem has a face and it's a human that you spend 4 years with trying to develop them, you can't not feel compelled to support them, and you can't not see other people in a similar circumstance that you can't turn a blind eye. If you're built like how I think we're all built, which is that kind of generous, we want to support someone else. All three of us made conscious decisions to leave industry to be educators, right? So we were already kind of looking at our KPI, and I think in that way. I don't know, Sam, what do you think?
I agree completely. I mean, humanizing a problem and bringing it to your doorstep is like, people in general are wired to not care until it affects them personally. And so even if it's not me that's being held back by something, if it's somebody I care about who is, and they walk into my office and say, I can't get a job anywhere, or there's not a single Black person working in this organization, but I'd love to be there, what do I do? Like, those kinds of problems, you just can't help but work on them. And so whenever something like that is brought to your attention, then just like Jeff said, I mean, you're hardwired to find a real solution. We're not putting Band-Aids on things. You really want to find something that's going to fix that problem. So the next kid who comes along, you don't have to start from scratch and reinvent the wheel for them. You've already got the solution in place, and you send them right where they need to go to break through whatever barrier it is that they're facing. So I think you're both spot on. I don't mean to keep just parroting the points y'all are making, but you've got to humanize the problem. You've got to give it a face. You've got to give it a name, and you've got to feel that empathy for it that's going to drive you to action.
Yeah, I think those are such great points, because, I spend a lot of time in data and creating a story through data. But you're right, there's something about that human element that makes it sticky, that makes it something that you can't forget. And ideally, that makes it something that, if it takes you losing sleep at night to wake up and fix this problem, well, as folks in the industry, or kind of, I won't say gatekeepers, but as folks charged with preparing those who are going to be the next generation leaders in this industry, yeah, those types of things should keep us up at night.
And it's interesting you say that. Like I can remember the data points, meaning like I can remember the people, I can remember the actual conversations, students' names, where like I would think about it a couple days later and I was like, that's not right. Like, what's going on there? Or like, unfortunately, you would see it play out. Like we would put on a networking event, right? So early on in my career at Johnson Wales, it was like my job to connect students with industry professionals. And like, and I was, oh my gosh, I created this great networking event. There's 30 professionals, there's 30 students. This is great. It was like matchmaking. I was so proud of myself. And I looked at the room and like my 30 professional contacts, like 28 of them were white. The 2 Black people were surrounded by Black students trying to talk to them, right? And then the other students are like people that didn't feel comfortable were basically wallflowers. Like I saw confident young kids that had tons of promise, like wilt, because they didn't feel comfortable. They didn't see representation. They didn't like, and that's like watching a train wreck, right? So I think when that stuff plays out, you're just doing math, and then enough of that happens enough, and then you're like, this is just a business case is there. Like we need to figure this out.
Yeah.
Another element to this too, and this goes back again to like, you see a problem, you don't want to put a Band-Aid on it, you want to fix it. Like when I was the director of the sports law and business program at ASU, and we had a hard time getting both Black candidates and female candidates to come in. And so at first you think about it from, okay, like where are there sources of female college students that we could now recruit to come join our program? And that's a fix, but it's not the fix because it doesn't solve the problem as to why they weren't coming in the first place. And so then you start thinking about, okay, like what are we missing that would actually make a difference in their lives? And then you start building in programming instead of just walking over to an all-girls school and saying, throwing flyers on the wall. You've got to provide something that's going to make a real difference in their lives. And I think that's the first step towards shifting your perspective on this and how to actually create a solution as opposed to fixing whatever the data point is and recreating that system.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love the concept of addressing this at a system level because the reality is sport biz camps, even before that, as 3 educators passionate about it, there's only so much pushing against the system that we can do to create progress. But awareness and ideally more folks buying in to the conversation and buying into being on the right side, or I won't say on the right side, but advocating for progress in this way. So one final question on that before we get to a bit more nuts and bolts of sport biz camps. When we look at the sports industry, and we've talked about it a bit, this brand of a boys club, and we can say and know that to mean kind of a white boys club, and that's a perception that it has existed for a while and continues today. Why do you think that is? And Sam, I'm going to pitch this one to you first.
It's a proximity thing. That's what Pat already talked about, that, it started early on. It was white male executives who climbed to the top. And then when they needed to hire somebody, they reached into their circle of white male friends and brought people in. And then as they grew and as the sports industry, because this industry as a business is fairly unsophisticated. I mean, it's a new business that's billions of dollars coming in. And so the people who are populating all of those executive positions are a lot of them are the ones who sort of created that position in the first place. And they're still doing it 30 or 40 years later. And again, they brought all their friends into that circle, and they continue to bring their friends into their circles, and they're still the ones in charge. And I think it's just now, the past few years and upcoming in the next 10 years or so is when we're going to have a changing of the guard, where this next generation of much more diverse people with much different perspectives and experiences are growing into executive roles and starting to take over teams and leagues. And I think that's when the change is going to start to happen. But I really do think it's just exactly what we've already said, that if somebody came to me and said, look, I need help, I need somebody for this position, the first person I'm going to ask is my close friend, who I think is perfect for it, who's probably a white male, because that's what I am and that's who I've been around the most. So I think it starts there.
Yeah. Anything to add, Pat or Jeff?
Yeah, I'd like to kind of take that again. I think a major contributor is it's a broken on-ramp, right? And again, I think that's why sports biz camps started there in addressing it, which is kind of getting that funnel up, right? So there's this proud rite of passage of I did the unpaid internship, and that's how I got got in the game. And the reality is that unpaid internship discriminates against the socioeconomic groups which are, not able to do that, right? If your income level makes you unable to take the unpaid internship, then you're not one of the people being successful in that internship and then, earning your way in. And if you can't get your foot in the door, how do you get your way to the top, right? And again, we saw it so much with our students. And early on, when I'd see a student asleep in class at 9:30, right, you get defensive about it. And you're like, hey, man, you got to step up your game. What's the deal here? If you can't come to play in class, you can't come to play outside. And oftentimes the answer is, well, sorry, Professor Longo, I did my 12 or 14-hour internship yesterday. And then afterwards, I went to one of my 2 part-time jobs so that I could, make bills me, got home at 2 o'clock. I came fired up, ready to go to class and just couldn't, here's where I'm at, right? Like that's a broken system, right? And I remember going back and I hear myself tell this story over the last 10 years to every class and cringe a bit on it, right? So I always tell the story how I got 150 resumes a week, when I worked for the Devils for jobs that we didn't, post, right? And where we started out that, to Sam's point, was everybody got in a room and we were like, who do we know who's crushed it for us? Like who's interned for us in the past? Who's done a great job, blah, blah, blah. But if the people are all coming from that unpaid internship pipeline, again, the odds of them looking and sounding much like me are that much higher. So, again, I think our role in it, at least personally, is, if 20 years later, Frank calls me saying, hey, I need a great student for this, and he calls Professor Jeff, I hopefully can steer him towards a candidate who may have a different look, feel, and perspective than I do.
I mean, it's the coaching tree, Vince, right? Like this is what makes our industry a really great case study or platform for increasing, expanding diversity within the sports industry. Like, look at like how people or our society use like Jackie Robinson's integration to like talk about integrating larger as a country. Like, look how we've like tried to use sports as a way to unite. When I say sports, and even just like look at professional athletes now, with like 70% of the NFL is African American, 70% of the NBA, 75-80% is African American. Like, so looking at it, it's like, oh wow, that's a great case study of like how to expand diversity. Awesome. But on the other side of the coin, like there's no diversity whatsoever. Like we've suggested it, we've facilitated it, we've lauded it, but like we're not really practicing it. And it's just coaching tree. Like whether you're black or white, you like what you know, right? So if people have the same background as you, or have something in common with you, or are on the same coaching tree, you're gonna pick them, unless you kind of intervene and disrupt and say, is that appropriate? Is that right? Is that really the best kind of hire for us? Is that really the best person for us? So I think we just kind of revert to what we know, I guess, is probably the easier answer. And that's what we call nepotism.
Yeah, no, and I think the sports industry is uniquely guilty of that, to Sam's point, because of this kind of huge stage and platform we get without having to have had really sophisticated business practices. It's almost a perfect spiral to lead to that. The only thing I'll add in terms of Boys Club and how that historically applies is just that, there was the advantage of, there's the first movers advantage, right? Except for in this case, the first movers were the only ones allowed to move. When we had, there's certainly a time in our history, probably not that long ago, where a woman as a general manager was not a conversation. And that's probably in my lifetime, it's probably like the 2000s. We're talking about women as team presidents and head coaches of NBA teams now. That those weren't conversations happening even 5 years ago. So you think of the how long it may take before that's a norm, and it ends up impacting both sides, the folks who may be interested, qualified, and then actually those who are doing. There's a lot of historical factors that play there as well. So I want to move
on firsts. We're still having firsts. I mean, we just had the first female Black athletic director in a Power 5 conference a couple of years ago.
Yep.
it's insane that at this point we're still having firsts like that. But
And I think part of when we talk about giving, I want to say a problem a face when we have a first, but giving this conversation a face, I think that's why we call it out when we have a first. It's like, hey, we're going to celebrate today because we should. We also want you to know that it's 2020 and this is the first time this happened.
That's the paradox of our industry, because our industry has been embracing diversity on the field, right? There was just I can't remember the bank, but I got an alert today. Like, one of the banks announced that they're going to have their first female CEO ever. So it'll be the first female CEO ever on Wall Street, right? But they haven't been employing, like they haven't been building a diverse pipeline of people to work for them, right? Like 70% of the NFL is Black. Right? The industry has been bringing it in and saying this is great and we want this kind of background or whatever, but just like forgetting about it on the whole other side of the business.
Yeah. And, I'm trying not to derail us because I have a thorn in my side called the business case for diversity and inclusion, which I understand. And I've been a proponent of, I've pushed, I've built presentations around, but what you're discussing and what you're talking about with the representation on the field and court for the NFL and NBA is almost a reason why you can't only do the business case for diversity and inclusion, because then that diversity enhanced the hell out of the bottom line for those sports. But it wasn't comprehensive because we got the money. We didn't have to change this side of it to do that. So, the system persists as is on one side only. So yeah, again, I'm not going to derail us for that. That's like a think piece conversation, but I do want to talk a little bit about the logistics now. Last year's camp 2019, it was in person, and that was in Charlotte. Pat and Jeff would love to hear what it was like bringing that to life, and then the impact for the students, but then also for you, kind of getting through that first camp.
Yeah, I think seems like forever ago. I was like looking at a recap the other day, and I was like, "Oh man, that was so cool! We got to actually like work with these kids. That was great." It's awesome to watch. You can see kids getting engaged. You can see confidence build. Not right away though. The high school kids are really hard to read. I don't know if you guys remember what you were like in high school, but for the most part, you don't really care about anything. You're kind of just hanging out, trying to look cool. And that was pre-smartphone. Now they just are like kind of buried in their phones. But you would see them kind of gush, and like when they walk around the facility, they get all excited. There's a hop in their step. But the things that are etched upon me from that experience were on the third day, we welcomed parents to come. And we wanted parents, we did a free college advising session for parents and students. And then we had parents stick around for kind of the closing ceremony. And I got like incredibly emotional because these parents would walk up to me at the end of the camp and say like, "Thank you so much for the help." And these were a lot of times, I remember even looking in the audience, one white male, 18 Black women, right? And they were so appreciative of our support and help because like they're working really hard to support their students and they're working really hard to keep them on the right track and do all those different things. And all they need is a little bit of help, right? And to see the amount of emotions that they were outpouring and how appreciative they were of the help was like kind of like still even makes me shake thinking about it now. So obviously that was the best part, was like having that immediate kind of gratification and seeing the emotion built along with it. And obviously probably Jeff, something you can kind of jump in, like watching them interact with professionals is fun too.
Yeah, when you talk about impact of the program again, like, but our first answer has to be those conversations with, mom, dad, grandma, and grandpa that we have before you ever get into the KPIs. Like, again, I could remember a specific conversation talking with one of our students' grandmothers who said, "I've not seen my grandson as fired up about something in years," right? So like the whole point of the camp is to expand the understanding of what other options are out there, let them know about the skill sets that are needed, and then make the connections, to them. So again, not only did they say, "Wow, I didn't know this position existed," but for the first time, they saw themselves in that role, right? Again, they saw somebody else that looked like them, was up there with a senior vice president title, just crushing it, and then felt comfortable having that conversation saying, man, how'd you get here? What'd the path look like? And now they've started a true and authentic mentorship with somebody who's in the industry doing great things in the industry that they now suddenly are as passionate about as they were about playing it for the last 15 years, you know?
No, that's powerful stuff. And yeah, again, I couldn't agree more that KPIs aside, when you get into the weeds of an experience like that, saying we had to pivot quite a bit, insert 2020. Big plans to expand, do a few different in-person camps in different markets. Do you want to kind of talk about what that pivot looked like for us in 2020 and how we were able to remain effective?
Yeah, this was, I mean, it's not unique to us that 2020 has thrown a gigantic curveball. And I honestly feel that our organization is stronger and better situated to make a larger impact because of it. And I think we're really fortunate for that. The opportunity to shift to an entirely virtual setting for our second camp, I mean, we had huge plans. We felt so strongly about how well things went in Charlotte in year one that our goal for 2020 originally was to double down in Charlotte and then break into 8 new cities, entirely new cities where we had touch points there, but we had never set foot there as an organization. And we were driving through hoping to reach 1,000 kids in year 2 all around the country, including, again, doubling our Charlotte efforts. So moving to a virtual program, it made that easier in 2 very stark ways. The first of which was that anybody can just log in from anywhere. So obviously it expands our reach even outside of those markets. And the other side of it was that it reduced our costs significantly. We're a nonprofit. And so we want the majority of our revenue, which is all fundraising and sponsorship and grant money, to go directly toward the impact. So as much as we can save on travel and lodging and all the other sort of peripheral costs that go into putting something on like this, it allows us to truly invest in the content and the mission and the students. And so this pivot to virtual has now turned us into much more effective. I mean, we've all been in the education space. We are all trained now, and I think passionate about showing kids what's out there, teaching them, but also getting them to understand how important education and self-betterment is, that journey is actually as important as, if not more important than the destination. So we've really set ourselves up to do that in a virtual space. And it also allowed us to tap into people that we wouldn't have had access to otherwise. I mean, we had an NFL owner join in, and we wouldn't have been able to fly him to Charlotte to be a part of this. But getting people of that caliber who really believe in what we're doing, and they only had to take an hour out of their day to just click a button and talk for a little bit, made a huge, huge difference. And so while we still have big plans to create in-person impact, because I do think being able to sit face to face, sit across the table from somebody, see them and be in the room with them and show them a facility, show them sort of the bones of a stadium and get them to understand what a day in the life of a football ops guy is or a football ops girl is. That's hugely important to helping raise that awareness of what's out there and what it really means to work in sports. But being able to do all this virtually and then eventually shift back into an in-person setting and combine those two so we can really approach everything from all angles. I mean, the high school students and now some college students that we're trying to reach, you said it, their faces are buried in their phones more often than not. And so we've got to come to where they are. And that's mobile, and that's digital. And so being able to do that now and setting ourselves up to do things like this, where we're creating virtual content that's going to be fairly evergreen and can really reach people wherever they are. It's convenient for them. It's easy to do. I think it sets us up to be a much stronger organization as we grow. We want to expand our career camp. We want to provide hands-on learning opportunities that go beyond just education and really make this an active experience and an immersive and engaging experience. And we also want to move into a space where we're not just educating students. I think there's a huge amount of education that needs to go to the organizations as well, where you've got to understand where the talent is, how to find it, how to develop it, how to recognize it. And so we want to be having these conversations, not just with students and job seekers, but with hiring managers, with organizations that need to do better at bringing in diverse talent. So I think we're setting up in addition to educating students, we want to be a big part of that conversation as well, so that ultimately we become the best source for talent in the sports industry, diverse especially.
Yeah, I think, and that speaks to activating on both sides of the mission. Supporting high school students, but also expanding diversity within this industry that we love. Pat, Jeff, I didn't know if you all wanted to add anything re our pivot in 2020. I know Sam covered it all pretty well.
Yeah, I'm going to go with Sam covered off pretty well on that.
Awesome. So you started to get into, this expanding of content, continue to build our students. Wanted to see, Pat, maybe you can start us off here. We've had a huge pivot. We learned a lot. We were able to engage in a way we certainly didn't see possible at the beginning of this year. What's next? Where do we go from here for Sports Biz Camps?
Yeah, so Sam alluded to a little bit, but it's an expansion of our audience. We've been laser focused on high school students to date for a variety of reasons, and those reasons still exist today. But it's an on ramp. The earlier you can have the conversation, the better. We're trying to build momentum. We're trying to promote social capital, like the same reason that you're trying to train as an athlete earlier on. We want to do the same thing from that standpoint. So we're always going to be upstream, and we want to be upstream, right? Like that's we view, like, if we're really going to help solve this problem, we need to start now for it to be different 5 years from now, right? So we're going to stay with that swim lane. But I think an expansion of other audiences, college students specifically, or even maybe immediately post-grad, that are dealing with the same challenges real time, right? So how can we better serve them and ultimately help propel them towards a career, right? So our job still is to get them into the pipeline and get them considered for jobs. So reaching them, helping them, supporting them, supplementing them, whatever you want to call it, with a different audience, I think is important. And then I think also, and then I'll stop talking on this, but I think we have a unique opportunity to gather insights from that group that I think can help our customers, which are the employers as well. So, I think we're not experts, right? So sometimes people get like, oh, like, you're not an expert. Like, what makes an expert? All right, fine. We're not experts in dealing with high school kids in sports business, but we know more than most people because we've done it more than most people, right? And even then with college students. So I think how can we can help the students and support them, and we're bringing them up, but how can we bring the employers down to their level and help the employers understand what these students are seeing, right? I think that's where we can help us. Hopefully we're helping on both sides of the equation. We're helping employers be smarter and adjust and help them understand what they need to do to attract a young, diverse, qualified working population. And ultimately we're kind of creating that in the back end. So hopefully we're on both sides of the continuum.
Yeah. So I got to ask and probably coming up on the last few questions, I got to ask the current events question. We talked a lot about, we started the conversation around privilege, and we talked a bit about, what we've done and what we're planning to do. With Sport Biz Camps launched in 2019, there was certainly no anticipation of the social justice movement we'd be experiencing this year. However, if anything, it only heightens the importance. So with the moment that we're experiencing and the role that sports is playing, diversity and inclusion as these hot topic buzzwords, but where do you see, and Jeff, maybe I'll pass this one to you to start. It's maybe a bit of a curveball, but where do you see diversity and inclusion evolving during this moment, during the moment that we're experiencing now, where Black Lives Matter is, splattered over commercials and streets that, across the country? Where do you think we graduate from here and the role of sports in this conversation?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And again, you see it with athletes using their platform, all that sort of stuff. Can't end there, right? And I think it goes back a little bit to what you were saying, and hopefully this is the case about the business case for diversity, right? Like, hopefully one of the outputs from this is that instead of pretending that we don't see color and don't see the differences, that we start to celebrate and embrace the differences that this diversity brings to the table, right? So I think as more people realize that diverse perspectives make their organization better. I mean, I came from the hockey world, right? No more white and more male world, than that. And I think organizations and people both can go through their whole lifestyle without realizing what they're missing out by not gaining this other perspective. And again, I think the shining a light on it helps people walk down that door, right? So I give the example of Tara Black, who I've worked with for a decade and a half. She's the COO of the Charlotte Checkers. She is literally the only female on the board of governors for the American Hockey League. That has been the case for the last 10 years. Every time she walks into that room, she is the only female. For the 5 years before that, when she walked into the board of governors meetings for the ECHL, she was the only female walking into that room, right? So you're going to tell me that there aren't other women as qualified as the men in that room as there are? Again, the number of people of color in the room, less than 1% throughout that 15-year span. You're going to tell me that there aren't, persons of color who are as qualified, if not more qualified, than the people that are in that room? That's a broken system, right? That's a broken system. So again, hopefully it's a recognition that this is additive to your organization, right? You're not just doing it to do it. You're not doing it only because, and I say again, only because it's the just and right thing to do, but it's also going to make you better organization for the next year, the next 5 years, the next 10 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, go ahead, Sam.
So I think there is a lot of change coming. And I think, Jeff, you mentioned the powerful voice of an athlete. I think athletes, we know dating back to the raised fist at the Olympics. Athletes have had a very powerful voice for a very long time. And they're only just now collectively starting to understand the leverage that they have. And I think there's this, and maybe I'm speaking out of turn on this, but there seems to be this assumption, especially from white people, that all people of color understand this and can speak to it in a very informed way. And that's not true. Like, just because you are a Black male doesn't mean you understand this struggle in any more heightened way. You certainly experienced it in a more heightened way, but it doesn't mean you understand the solution just because you're living it. And so I think there's a much greater awareness of that too, that like this is a collective problem that's targeting a certain group of people that we all need to be a part of fixing. And I think the awareness there is higher than it's ever been. Organizations everywhere are hiring chief diversity officers, which was 5 years ago unheard of. It was very much a rare thing to see that. And now it's everywhere in sports and a lot of other groups too. The next step has to be that not only hiring a chief diversity officer or somebody of an equitable role, but funding it, giving it true backing and power, giving that role a seat at the table, not making it somebody who's got to answer to 5 bosses to get to the CEO. They've got to have a seat on the board. And it's got to be somebody who truly understands this and can affect change within their organization, within the impact that organization makes in their communities. There's so many layers to what has to happen here. And it's so highly scrutinized in sports because of what Pat keeps saying, that the percentage of Black athletes on the field in our major sports is not at all represented in the boardrooms. And I think that's going to start to change too. You've got athletes now who are raising enough generational wealth where they can start to become minority owners in teams. And that never happened in the past. I think that's going to be a big step too. And that's not to say that in order to make a change, you need to have enough money to buy a team, because obviously that's barely 1% of people who can do that. But I think that's one of the many steps. That's one of the many directions we're heading in.
And Vince, I know we're going to close up, but I think this is something we were going to talk about. And I think it's something we need to go ahead and vocalize and address, because I think it's part of what we're talking about. Like, we are 3 white men, right? Like, we're here talking about diversity, equity, inclusion. We're 3 white men on the board of like trying to. So there's definitely we've had our path to understanding this, and people, if nothing else, are consistently inconsistent, right? Like, 5 in a past life, we're going for a brainstorm session, and you're putting together the people you want to brainstorm. You want diverse perspective, right? Because you want to get a bunch of different thoughts on it. Agreed? Everyone says they want that. For whatever reason, we've never attributed diverse perspective to gender or race. And it's because white men don't want to humble themselves and recognize that they've had privilege, point blank, right? Like that would basically knocking us down a peg. Like, you're less than. I've worked hard. We've done all those different things, whatever. But that's the honest conversation. Like, do I deserve everything I got? I don't know. Did I work hard for it? Yeah. Did I have some legs up? Clearly. And it took me a long time to figure that out. But I think as it gets back to like the task at hand and like the specific salient points, I think it's important. While we lack diversity as a leadership team, we appreciate the value of diversity and we're committed to doing it. And we want to help other people understand their privilege, right? And we were fortunate to have the proximity. And that's how we came to understand it. If we can facilitate that proximity, right? If we can help people unpack that, and we're not looking to indict anyone or anything, it's not about indictment. It's about recognition. And then upon recognition, you can feel one of two emotions: shame, right? Which is going to lead to, I don't believe that I'm going to be a part of that. Like, that's not me. Like, no, that's bullshit. Like I did this myself. Or a part of the solution and action. We've chosen the latter, right? So I think that's where we sit as three white men trying to help solve this problem. Is hopefully people will have the conversation with us and see it from that standpoint, because that's what we need to figure out.
I think that's so important. I'm glad you brought it up, Pat, because that is the takeaway. Well, one of the key takeaways from that is we need all voices in this conversation. We need everyone to. I think that I'm reading a book now, Person You Mean to Be, and one of the chapters is titled "You Can't Be a Part of the Solution Until You Accept that you're part of the problem." And that's for everybody. Me as a Black sport business executive trying to rise to the top, I'm part of the problem because there's a lot that I'm gonna have to fight to get there. But if everybody else considers themselves not part of the problem, it's like fighting an invisible enemy. So until we all sit and can settle with we're part of the problem, oh, and hey, now that we accept that we can be part of the solution, it's going to be kind of the cycle will continue, because this isn't anything new for our industry or really for society in general. I didn't know if I saw some light bulbs go off. Sam, Jeff, anything y'all wanted to add to that piece of it? I'll close out with.
I'd like to let Pat close it out for us. He's got the gift of gab.
No,
that was strong.
I mean, I had a conversation this morning with a person that's in the sports industry, and he's African American. He's in the DEI space, and he brought up something I thought was interesting, which was like, people might think we're like profiteering or being opportunistic with like social unrest and like Black Lives Matter, whatever. Like we flew our flag before that stuff happened, right? Like, and we're going to continue to keep it going. Now that there's more recognition around it, or even that's more politicized, I think it's important for us to call this what it is. Like people need to have the honest conversations. There's some simple solutions to this. Like, make Black friends. Like spend time with Black people. Like open it up and don't recoil and say like I deserve this, or I have. No, it's about like humbling yourself, recognize the problem, and then just being part of the solution. Like, nothing we do is groundbreaking. Like we bring people together to talk about their jobs as the high school kids, right? But it can have a profound impact. And I think once you've, for us, especially in what's going on today, right? Like, I mean, Vince, we've had really like emotional conversations like this group and other folks about like all that's going on in the world. It's really hard to feel good about anything these days. And I have my days, right? But at least I can go to bed at night feeling like I'm a part of the solution going forward. And that motivates me. And I think a lot of people can rally around that. And specifically, I'm talking to white men. Like, that's where we need to get involved. Like, don't feel shame, feel a sense of action. And I think you're going to find that you're going to sleep better at night.
Yeah. In the same book, and I guess I should give the author a shout out, Dolly Chung. She uses the same framing of shame, and she juxtaposes that to guilt. Shame often triggers defense mechanism, or maybe you sit in sorrow, and to your point, we're going to deflect. Now I'm going to find a way to distance myself from the thing that makes me feel ashamed. But when you feel guilt, you're most often driven to action. Now that I have a sense of guilt, and I've had that conversation with folks around, the Black Lives Matter movement of 2020 has really brought to light their privilege. And now I feel guilty about that. Well, it's good. Sit in that, experience it, because with that guilt should come some type of action. Whether it is interpersonal, and to your point, Pat, I'm going to take the first step of learning more about people of color that may be around me, or maybe I got to put myself in new settings to get that experience. Or maybe it's systemic and I'm a CEO, and rather than hiring that first person that came to mind, I'm going to be intentional about creating a process where at the very least, I'm not moving until I see 2 candidates of color who are finalists for this role. Like, those are little things that people in those positions can do literally the moment they stop listening to this conversation. So I think that's a great place to wrap. So, this is the beginning of a series of content that we're going to be bringing, where we want to just start having conversations that are relevant to the current events and to our mission. Again, increasing social mobility for high school students, and expanding diversity and inclusion throughout the sports industry. So Sam, Pat, Jeff, I feel it feels weird to say thanks because you're such a big proponent, a part of creating and why this platform exists. But I'm super excited about working with you all, and really excited to see where Sport Biz Camps goes from here. I think it's only up. Thanks for coming. Thanks for
Thank you, Vince. Thanks
yeah.
for everyone that joined live. Really appreciate it. But no, thanks, Vince, for leading the conversation. And you're a big part of our mission, but even individually, like we draw strength from working with you. You open up our eyes to things that on a consistent basis that I wouldn't otherwise think of. And then at the end of the day, like, you're making us smarter and you're allowing us to get better and grow. So thanks for your support.
100%. I love it.
Thanks, everybody.
Peace.